Hi, I'm Yaakov Katz, and before we begin today's episode, let me announce a small housekeeping matter. We have changed our name and will now be called the Jewish People's Podcast, JPPI. All else will stay the same. We will continue to bring you conversations with leading experts, politicians, and thought leaders as we delve into topics that you care about, such as Israel diaspora relations, religious and cultural identity, Israeli politics, and contemporary Jewish life. As we have been doing for the last 8 months, we'll continue to try in each episode to inform and engage in insightful discussions and in-depth analysis of the issues that matter. On Thursday night, there was a report on Channel 12 News here in Israel about a meeting that the National Security Advisor Tzachi Hanegbi had with families of hostages and their relatives. Based on the report, this meeting could not have been more callous. Hanegbi, a former Likud minister and member of Knesset, reportedly told the hostage families that the government will not accept a deal for the hostages' release that forces Israel to end the war. If that doesn't happen, if there is no other deal, he said, he went on to admit that there was no alternative plan. At one point, when a daughter of one of the hostages criticized the government, and particularly Prime Minister Netanyahu, Hanegbi pushed back. He told her not to talk that way. Really? She should not talk that way after the failures of the government that you represent? This reality is heartbreaking and painful for us all. But we can only imagine what is going through the minds of the relatives of their hostages. Their lives have been upended for the last 241 days, not knowing what will happen. Are their relatives even alive? Will they ever return home? I spoke a few days ago with Professor Jonathan Dekel Chen, father of Sagui, himself the father of 3 young girls, who was from Nir Oz and it was taken there on October 7th, held in Gaza since. Sagui, an Israeli-American citizen, is one of 8 Americans still being held in Gaza. And I caught up with Jonathan just before he was scheduled to depart for another trip to the United States to meet with top officials there in the Biden administration. Jonathan is a professor of history at Hebrew University. He's taught over the years and written about pogroms in Eastern Europe. He tells us about Sagui, his daughter-in-law Avital, who he described as a lion, what he wants to see his government in Israel do to get his son and the remaining hostages home, and what is his work as a historian who's written extensively, as I mentioned, on Eastern Europe, what has that taught him about the events of October 7th? This is an important interview. Have a listen. Professor Jonathan Dekel Chen, thank you very much for joining us on the JPPI podcast. You've been really at the forefront to a large extent of the efforts, definitely in the US side of things, to move along and try to advance a potential deal that would bring home your son, Sagui, as well as the other hostages who are still being held in Gaza. Where do you see things as they are now? Because it seemed that maybe a deal was coming a few weeks ago. That disappeared. Israel's now in Rafah. Maybe a deal is back on the table. Hamas is making all of its demands. How do you view everything that's happening?
Well, as you might imagine, after nearly 8 months since the massacre on October 7th, I have learned the hard way that in order to survive as a parent, or I think any concerned citizen, we have to be very careful of not getting on a kind of a emotional roller coaster with the ups and downs of the negotiation process. Look, at base, of course, the single greatest problem is that at the other end of this negotiation process, wherever it happens to be at any given moment, we have a ruthless terrorist organization that has one goal, which is the destruction of Israel, one way or another. And so given that, one has to just breathe deeply in order to survive this. I have no expectations from Hamas. And I think no right-thinking person should have expectations from Hamas in terms of their willingness to to even hint at a bit of humanity. And that's true, of course, in their approach to Israelis and probably Jews in general, and even their own people. I mean, when you look at it, the suffering of well over 1 million Gazans right now could end in an hour tomorrow morning if Hamas were to unilaterally release those prisoners who are still alive, those hostages who are still alive, and the bodies of those that it's already murdered. Israeli public opinion would be overwhelming to make the fighting stop as well at that moment.
Right.
But that is unfortunately a dream world, and we have to focus on the world that we have. So Hamas needs to be pressured. There's no question. It needs to be coerced one way or another into releasing these people, the vast majority of whom were ripped from their homes, civilians who were ripped from their homes, or as we saw in a recent video, terrified young women taken from army bases or from a rave concert on a Saturday morning. That being said, of course, the question is, okay, what about the Israeli government? And which is the other side. I mean, there are intermediaries, of course, US, Qatar, Egypt, perhaps others. But Israel also has to agree. And unfortunately, as a very proud, or certainly until October 7th, a very proud Israeli citizen, there is enormous reason for doubt about the seriousness of the intent of Israeli leadership to get as many hostages home as possible who are still alive and recover the bodies of those who have been murdered. And that really runs up to last night, when National Security Advisor Sagui was reported to have been absolutely brutal with families. Not myself, I was not there, so I can only go by reports, in terms of his callousness and seeming complete uncaring to the face of these hostage families about the fate of their loved ones. I find this intolerable, but indicative of not so much what individual ministers or our prime minister might say about the hostages, rather what they're actually doing, which is clearly not enough to get them home.
So just for our listeners and to know what Sagui was reported to have said, basically telling families of hostages that they won't become, this government won't be able to make a deal. It won't come home. When when a daughter of a hostage, Ella, started to say, but you guys are focused on building pools for the prime minister and things like that. He said, you have no right to say things like that. You want to curse me. Very, as you said, very callous, very aggressive, and completely inappropriate. I want to push on that a little, but I do want to just zoom out for a moment, Jonathan. Sagui, your son, and I was reading up just a bit more about him before this conversation, really sounds like a remarkable young man, married to Millie, as she's named her, Avital, the father of 3 daughters, the third born while he's in captivity. Avital was 7 months pregnant when he was taken. But really a man who also worked with you very much in the project of Bikurim, of the music village that you established a bunch of years ago, a few years ago, down in the Eshkol region, right near the kibbutz where you're all living in, near Oz. Tell us about Sagui, his family, what he's like, and how does his family, and of course you, but I wonder about Avital and the 3 children. How are they?
Well, we'll start with Avital and the 3 girls. They are doing as well as one could possibly expect. Avital is a lion, this sort of rail-thin mother of 3 little girls, who is the hero in this story, in our story, our family story. Keep in mind that Avital survived the massacre, 7 months pregnant with her 2 little girls, in a safe room on our kibbutz, while there was a massacre going on just outside of the door of their bomb shelter, their attached bomb shelter to their home. They were in darkness for, quite literally, for hours on the kibbutz between the time that the attack began very early and until finally the army arrived at her home on the kibbutz at around 4:30 in the afternoon. So she and the girls, at the time a 2-year-old and a 6-year-old, uh, survived the living hell, while Sagui was outside of the house doing what he could, along with other young and not so young men on the kibbutz, trying to defend in what turned out to be a hopeless attempt against the terrorists, because the Israeli army, never arrived on Nir Oz. As far as Sagui specifically, he's my 35-year-old little guy. Sagui is an extraordinary man. He grew up on Kibbutz Nir Oz along with my other kids. And as a young father, decided, as many have been doing in the last 15 or so years, with a young family, he decided to come back to the kibbutz. He had been doing what many young Israelis do, get kibbutz kids and as well, sort of testing out the big city, testing out the world, but decided to come back and live on the kibbutz and grow his family, which he had been doing, I'd say, for about the last 10-ish years. Sagui is a builder and a creator. That's what he does. He serves communities that he finds valuable, and that's, of course, the kibbutz, but also outside of it, his day job is still as a national project coordinator for the UK branch of the Jewish National Fund. But as a moonlighting job, and myself as well, in 2014, Sagui, his older brother Itai, and Tamar Kedem we joined together to create out of nothing, as my wife would say, paper clips and scotch tape, a national youth village for the arts, not just music. It already has a theater program and has had for some time, a theater program and a visual arts program, simply because we wanted to and we knew that it was necessary. But Sagui has gone far beyond that in his roles, and his as a sign of his creativity, his moonlighting job passion really is to convert old buses into usable objects. It started as an RV, which his wife put the kibosh on after it was done. Was not pleased with this idea that they would spend their lives sort of traveling around the country in an RV as a lifestyle. It then went to mobile grocery stores to service food deserts in Israel, and there are many. And most recently, and on that morning of October 7th, he was on the kibbutz, as was his habit, early morning on a Saturday or holidays, to convert old airport buses into mobile technology classrooms. He had recently signed a contract with an Israeli nonprofit to do that, also to serve underserved communities in Israel South, and there are a lot of those in Israel South. Had I been on the kibbutz that morning, I would have been with him. It was kind of our bonding thing. As you said, we wound up doing a lot together. And so it's very likely I would have been with him, and I imagine shared a common fate with him.
He was out there, right? He had gotten up early, was working on retrofitting one of those buses when he saw the Hamas terrorists infiltrate the kibbutz. And then he alerted, I read, the kibbutz internal kind of warning system to let people know, went back to the home, to Avital, and then eventually left the safe room, as you said before, where she remained with the 2 daughters, 7 months pregnant. What do you know of what happened to Sagui after that moment?
Well, I'm going to roll it back just a bit in order to understand what was going on Nir Oz at in those moments, and we're talking about roughly 6:30 to 9:30 in the morning on October 7th, after having seen the first group of well-trained, heavily armed terrorists inside the kibbutz. He and others put out an alarm to the kibbutz. There were other people, who were early risers that day. Over the course of the next 2 hours, he and other young men on the kibbutz were trying to ascertain what on earth was going on. Eventually, it became clear that there were about 200 of these Nukhba, they call themselves commandos, they're terrorist butchers, inside the kibbutz rampaging, and along with them several hundred looters, most of them unarmed, some of them armed, simply going through the kibbutz and stealing whatever they could, whatever they wanted, and then burning everything else. And that went on until around 8:30, meaning people trying to ascertain what was going on all the time, waiting for the army to arrive, because that was always our expectation. That's the unwritten contract for these border kibbutzim. We are the breadbasket of the country. We are a source of creativity, of financial strength for the country, a human signpost at the border. But when in a time of need, and there was never a time of need, anything even similar to October 7th, the army would arrive quickly, actually within 15 minutes, 12 to 15 minutes. It never happened on October 7th. And so that struggle was hopeless. By 8:30, the rest of the young and again, not so young men who were trying somehow to contain or to control what was going on in the kibbutz, all communication had been lost with them. We now know that they were either killed, most of their bodies taken by Hamas back to Gaza, or wounded and then also taken. Sagui then went back home to make sure that his wife and two little girls were locked into the safe room adjacent to their house. All of our homes had them since 2008. Once he had ascertained that, he exited the safe room again and engaged to the degree that he could with the terrorists who were rampaging, still very much so, in his neighborhood around the kibbutz. And at some point, he was taken hostage around 9:30. That's what we know.
Interestingly, lots of the hostages came from Nir Oz. It was actually, I think, the kibbutz were the single most largest group
by far.
By far. Why do you think that? I mean, the proximity. What was it about Nir Oz that led to that?
Look, there must be a major impartial investigation of the events of October, government investigation, national investigation about what happened on October 7th in general and what led to the events of October 7th. And I pray, although there's no word for it in Hebrew, I pray that there will be accountability for all of those on the Israeli side who were responsible for this colossal disaster and failure on October 7th. I can only conjecture, but it's based on, I think, solid evidence. The big difference between Nir Oz and the other kibbutzim that were assaulted is not the distance from the border. There are other kibbutzim. We're about a mile from the border. My home was about a mile from the border with Gaza. It was not about geographical distance. It was about if and when the army arrived. As I said, in our case in Nir Oz, the army began to arrive at around 2:30 in the afternoon, many hours after the assault began, approximately 1 hour after the terrorists and most of the looters had already left the kibbutz of their own volition for reasons that we don't entirely understand. During those many hours of hell, they did whatever they wanted to. Again, by 8:30,
They had free reign, basically.
That free reign. Unlike the other kibbutzim, where at some point in the morning, sometimes quite early in the morning, army organized, more or less organized small units of the army, or even individual soldiers arrived on the kibbutzim, were able at the very least to contain what was going on so that the terrorists couldn't rampage through the entire community. And therefore they had less time, the terrorists, to capture and then physically take hostages back to Gaza. So in the end, of the 240 hostages who were taken from Israel to Gaza on October 7th, 78 of them were from Kibbutz Nir Oz. In the prisoner for hostage exchanges that occurred in late November, early December, about 40 of the 100 hostages who were returned to Israel were from Nir Oz, women and children, teenagers. But we
Have you?
still have 36 hostages remaining in Gaza. We know for sure that 10 of them were murdered on October 7th, and their bodies taken to Gaza. So 26 that we pray are still alive, and 10 that we know for sure are.
And Sagui among them without really knowing anything about his fate.
Well, we know from testimonies of the hostages, the women and a couple of the teenagers who came out in late November, early December, they were able to give us testimony about what they had witnessed in the tunnels under Gaza, and a handful of them encountered Sagui and several other hostages from near Oz. So they saw him. They were able to report that he was alive in late November, early December. But since then, we have no proof of life whatsoever.
So I want to go back to what we started with in the remaining time. And, you've traveled a lot across the world, particularly to the United States. You're a U.S. citizen. Sagui is a U.S. citizen. You've met with highest officials in America. What is your expectation, if any, from the United States to do on behalf? There still are 5 American hostages who are being held in the Gaza Strip.
Well, actually, there are 8. It's important to remember that.
Sorry.
There are 5 that we presume are still alive.
Are alive. 3
that we know confirmed were murdered on October 7th.
I stand corrected. 8, yes.
Yeah, no, it's an important.
No, 100% right. Yes.
But it's really important that we remember, all of us, that those who have already been killed, they and their families deserve the right to bury them.
They should be brought home. No question. Yeah. Yes, no question.
Well, yes, you're right. I and the other families of the American hostages, from around October 8th or 9th, have been in frequent and consistent contact with various agencies in the United States, up to and including the president's office. As an example, next week, if all goes as planned, we'll be meeting, I can't even count, in person, the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan. And I cannot express to your viewers enough the abyss between, and when we started out with this, the comments of our National Security Advisor in Israel, Tzachi Hanegbi, the abyss between the treatment that we as hostage families have received from one National Security Advisor in the United States versus Tzachi Hanegbi here in Israel. I don't say that with pride. I say that with enormous pain. There's something wrong with this government, with our government, in its orientation towards getting the hostages home and the hostage families. In any case, you asked what more could we ask for? Well, there are 2 answers to that question. The first answer is that everyone, meaning Israel, the United States, and the intermediaries, will have done enough when all of the hostages are home. Until then, not enough has been done. That being said, I don't think any reasonable person, and I know a little bit about history, U.S. history included, no reasonable person could have expected a U.S. administration to do more for Israel in general during this time, and for the hostages specifically, not just the 8 American hostages, but for all 125 remaining hostages. The U.S. has been clear about this. They're not in the business of just, in this case, getting the U.S. hostages out. They are working really night and day as hard as they can in order to get the hostages out. Look, the SEALs aren't going to rescue the hostages, my son or anybody else. At the end of the day, Israel and Hamas must agree to some sort of negotiated settlement. The United States is doing what it can as an outside party to pressure all sides into making this happen. So I know that there are criticisms of the Biden administration from all sides, which probably is an indication that they're doing the right thing. If you're being attacked by 2 separate sides for something that you're doing, it's a pretty good sign that what you're doing is okay. And it's important to note that the Biden administration for months now has been absorbing an enormous domestic political cost for its actions, yet it stays true. Friends are allowed to disagree. Yes,
Yeah.
there are, narrow issues on which the US is unhappy with Israel. And I think that's absolutely legitimate. And the US is a superpower. Israel, on a good day, and I'm not sure it's true anymore, is a regional power. There are different interests at play here, but the US government has shown its commitment to Israel and more specifically to the fate of all the hostages.
One thing that I have difficulty shaking is, Netanyahu, who we've known over the years, when he wants to promote an issue, whether it's to go to the UN and hold up a picture of a Iran nuclear cartoon bomb and push that around the world, he knows how to do that. And we haven't seen him take on the hostages as a big as the campaign for Israel, because that's the right thing to do. I think I can only think of one picture that I've seen him with when it was Seder night on Passover, that he took there was actually a photo of him with a picture of the hostages who are still being held in Gaza. I mean, what do you think it is beyond, maybe is it just politics? I don't want to be associated with the hostages because they are the symbol of failure, or is it something beyond that?
That's probably a subject for an entire podcast, to be honest with you, Yaakov. It's it's easy, unfortunately, it's quite easy to become a cynic. I've lived in Israel for my entire adult life. Um, at sort of the hard end of Israeli life, out on the periphery, on a violent border, with a government that more often than not doesn't really seem to care about what's going on in the periphery or along the border. But this is so far beyond the pale, meaning our prime minister's um, absolute distancing himself and his government from the fate of the hostages, that it's almost inexplicable. And I think there's no way of avoiding the fact that this is in great part for his own political needs domestically. He has a ruling coalition now in which the people calling the shots on pretty much everything, including the conduct of the war, are radical,
Yeah.
messianic zealots whose goal has nothing to do with getting the hostages home. None of the hostages are their constituents. I wonder sometimes, and there's no answer to this question, how this war would have played out and how the Israeli government's approach to hostages would have played out had even a small plurality of the hostages been from constituencies that are identified with the radical right messianic ministers in Netanyahu's cabinet. I don't know the answer to that question, but it is something that plagues me. As far as Netanyahu is concerned, his biggest priority, and more than half the country is saying this, you don't have to believe me, is that his conduct of the war, including his policy towards the hostages, is based almost entirely not on the national interest, but on him trying to preserve power, keeping his coalition together and
Right.
producing a completely fantastical vision of what total victory would look like over Hamas that has no connection to reality and certainly condemns the remaining hostages who are still alive to death. Um, it's painful to say that,
Yeah.
but this is the government that we have. I know that there are some, even among the hostage families, who are really pushing for Netanyahu to be replaced as some kind of remedy. Unfortunately, in the current situation, where his current coalition will do anything to stay in power and sacrifice our hostages and many Israeli soldiers for nothing. And some fantasy about what total victory looks like over Gaza. I don't see an outcome where any of them step down or initiate new elections. It's not going to happen. This is the government that we have.
Yeah. No, it's painful. It's painful to see and to hear. I want to ask you one last question, Jonathan, and then let you go. You are, beyond obviously being the father of Sagui and other children, a grandfather, the Bikurim village, but you are a professor of history at Hebrew University. And I was just looking through some of your publications, and you've written about you hold the chair of Rabbi Edward Sandro Chair in Soviet and East European Jewry at Hebrew University, and you've written extensively over the years on Russia and Soviet Jews and Eastern European Jews, but also about pogroms. And I think about your work, which I wonder even how do you keep working while you have this whole side job now, which probably takes up much more of your attention and time and resources. But when you look at the historical context of October 7th and what we're facing today with your expertise, what does that mean? How do you look at it?
Well, it's a good and sort of natural question to ask. Yes, I'm a professor of history, and yes, I'm still teaching. I've found it to be, for a few hours a week, great escapism, to instead of thinking about the awful situation in which the whole country finds itself, to be transported to, Eastern Europe in the middle of the 19th century. It's a kind of escapism. But these days, certainly since October 7th, I'm much, much less of a professor and much more of a father of a hostage, a member of a completely shattered community, keeping in mind, if your viewers aren't aware of this, Kibbutz Nir Oz no longer exists. We are part of a large community of evacuees, of refugees in our own country from the destroyed kibbutzim of the South. In addition, of course, to all of the evacuees from the north and other places in the south. Look, as a historian, and you're right, I've written, and in that case, actually just edited a book about pogroms, looking in new ways at pogroms, why they happened, why they didn't happen, was no less important. Look, the biggest single difference between all of this or the two major differences. First difference, we'll start with the less important. Hamas is unlike, or October 7th was unlike a pogrom for two reasons. The less important reason is that Hamas, whether we liked it or not, was a governing authority in the Gaza Strip,
Right.
and mobilized all of its resources to execute a massacre on October 7th. That's the first difference, because pogroms didn't work that way. Pogroms, as historians have shown now for years, almost always are kind of spontaneous mass violence. No governments usually try to suppress them, if anything, wherever they occur. So that's the first difference. The other difference is far more important. Wherever pogroms happened, whenever the pogroms happened, there was no sovereign Jewish state.
Yeah.
There was no Israeli army. There was no, startup nation behind or trying to protect or tasked to protect its own citizens. The vision of 1948 on the ashes of the Holocaust was to first and foremost protect the citizens of Israel, Jewish and non-Jewish, by the way. That's the first order of business. The first order of business, unlike what Ben-Gvir and Smotrich and perhaps Netanyahu believe, the first order of business, or the first right that we received from 1948, was not to kill our enemies. That's not Jewish, that's not Israeli, that's not Zionist, that's not human. It's to protect Israeli citizens. And that, beyond, the minutia of what went wrong on October 7th, that is the great failure of October 7th, that our country, the Jewish state, miserably failed to protect its own citizens. And today, 8 months later, this same government, and Netanyahu has been in power more or less consistently from 1996, by its deeds and even by its words, is refusing to protect those citizens who are or prioritize as an absolute first order of business the fate of those citizens that were abducted on its watch on October 7th. So perhaps, well, I'm sure history is not going to be kind to any of these leaders, but they will go down, along with the most miserable biblical failures if they do not work and do everything necessary to get the hostages home and abandon this nonsense about military pressure on its own is going to get them released by the way. This is nonsense. There's no proof of concept, and it will simply get all of the remaining living hostages killed. And so that is a situation we find ourselves in, with some very old and nonsensical thinking in a world that changed after 1948. But unfortunately, the people calling the shots in the Israeli government, again, these sort of messianic zealots, are completely unwilling to recognize that the modern state of Israel has obligations to which they are completely unconnected. These people, and they unfortunately they are the ones who are forming and in great part the ones behind the execution of Israeli policy in war.
Professor Jonathan Dekel Chen, thank you so much for joining us. Our thoughts and prayers will stay with you and Sagui, of course, and Avital, and the three young girls, hoping and praying that he comes home as soon as possible. Thank you very much.